We have nice time now for discussions. I thought perhaps maybe our first speaker would like to comment.
I mean, this is a very important intervention. I wish you see it in a elaborate form. I have only two minor questions. One is that actually, if you look at it carefully, it is not that people are looking for a composite culture. I mean, many people are doing it. It's ideological portion. Forget that. But people are accustomed to live with very radical diversities in India. But those diversities and recognition of them is not part of the Enlightenment agenda, and therefore they have a ring of something very peculiar, odd, esoteric, and if I may add, almost quasi-savage. Yeah. For instance, I mean, this involves two diametrically opposite, not diametrically opposite, two very different concepts of cosmopolitanism in India. I suspect that your agenda will be better served by a concept of cosmopolitanism which does not reject the idea, which does not, or let me put it the other way around, does not believe that each person must slowly shed all his or her prejudices, stereotypes, and negative imageries of other identities or communities and all, to be able to become cosmopolitan. Yeah. I think the traditional or alternative form of cosmopolitanism in India, and this is in my coaching study, I have tried to explore it, but I was a newcomer there to this. So, in fact, I learned from the study myself that the experiments in cosmopolitanism in India always presumed that you don't have to shade them, that you may mutually dislike each other, but it is possible to have the other as not only a valued part of yourself, but as an inalienable and ineluctable part of yourself. The other defines you in crucially. In Kochi, they are not loved with each other. It took me nearly 5 years to find that out. But they cannot do with each other. The world is incomplete with the other. It's an epic vision of life. I somewhere call it epic vision of life, where you have to have gods and demons to complete the epic. So, in that vision, there is scope for radical diversity.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, sure. Yes.
No, I completely agree with you. I mean, I think in a sense that was in a sense part of the point, which is I think we have got caught up too much in this sort of expunging inconvenient beliefs enterprise, and frankly, I think that project is a non-starter. But I think on the reverse side, I think one of the things which I didn't have time to go into. But this is the sort of the word we haven't used so far in this discussion, which is the word democracy. And the reason democracy matters and is that in some ways, I think what democracy does is democracy upsets precisely the kind of equilibrium that you were describing in Kochi. It upsets it in some fundamental ways. First of all, those modes of accommodation were, if you like, quasi-segmented. So, you had these mosaics of cities where sort of Muslims live, and there's a power-sharing arrangement. There are all kinds of participatory rituals that allow precisely the gods and demons to move together. But the anxieties arise when you, in a sense, begin to compete in same spaces. So the conundrum which we've not answered since 1857, which was the one Syed Ahmad Khan raised following Mill's Chapter 16 of On Representative Government, is what would be a form of representative government that could both protect people's vestments and identities, yet at the same time create a sense of common citizenship. 1905 to 1947, we have a history of failed negotiations over the question of representation. The simple answer was, which was the Lala Rajput answer, one person, one vote. You know, you make the idea of being Muslim or being Hindu irrelevant to how you configure political power. That project got no political traction. Once that project didn't get, then we kept going round in circles. Well, if you give Muslims veto power, isn't that unjust giving of power to a community where, in the context of creating a discourse of common citizenship? Now, but you can extend this argument further. When the state begins to distribute goods on lines of community identity, it upsets that equilibrium again. And I think one of the things we have to face up to is the way in which a discourse of representative government also puts pressure on precisely those modes of accommodation. And you know, we all like representative government, at least. You know, at least I think I do. But the internal logic of representative democracy also makes it much more difficult to simply assume that that equilibrium can now be simply recreated.
Thank you. Thank you. Akhil?
Yeah, you know, Ashish, you pointed out that Savarkar thought that that India should sort of understand that there's things going along a sort of evolutionary path, and we are going to inherit what the West had in the past, and so on. And that Gandhi was the opposite, that he didn't think there was anything compulsory about the trajectory that the West had taken, and so on. And it's interesting in this exchange between the two of you that you pointed out that Gandhi had a kind of anarchism that owes to, you know, our own traditions, Hinduism and Buddhism. But he also showed a very studied indifference to representative democracy. You know, it isn't as if he was against it. He didn't say he was against it, or he didn't, you know, when things came up in all sorts of provincial levels and so on, he had things to say about it. But he had an indifference to it. I mean, in the deepest, in his heart, he didn't have. And this is part of the thing, that we don't have to take this trajectory, etc. It's part of, and I noticed, Pratap, that you also, there was a moment, I was looking at the expression on your face, you said, well, I guess I'm in favor of representative democracy. So it just shows that when Gandhi raised this question about, you know, of our agency, that we don't have to follow this path, etc., he was speaking to your hesitation and your own thing. And, you know, the idea that the so, fess up.
No.
Yes, that's a good. Yeah.
No, I mean, I agree. I mean, the hesitation stems from, in a sense, the fact that I think, given what we have seen of the operations of representative democracy, I don't think we can be blind to or oblivious to the fact that it has unleashed all kinds of forces which its defenders did not think it would. And some of those forces, at least, or at least some of the violence that is thrown up, is in a sense internal to the structure of the demand over representations. The one way I put the paradox often is that, you know, the oddity about, let's say, justice in representation is, of course, you don't have a representative process that can decide what is just in representation. On the face of it, you can have four normative theories that look equally reasonable, right? But for various reasons, nobody trusts the state enough to be able to carry on through the logic of any one of them. And I think the biggest failure of modern India was precisely to solve the representation question. I mean, I don't think there was any solution on the table from 1905 to 1947 that was a workable, that was a stable solution. So, and that's a conundrum we are still, in a sense, you know, I think we've actually marginalized it because, you know, we think let's work with whatever this modus vivendi we have. But the question of representation remains the unstated, you know, premise in Indian